During this COVID pandemic, Shirley's anxiety has been just as bad, if not worse, than it was the year after her husband passed away. And with her age and her health, she's high risk for developing serious complications from the disease. She's had trouble sleeping because her mind races with worries. Are the groceries that are getting dropped off virus-free? How will she get to her doctor's appointments? When will she be able to rejoin her breakfast club ladies? Ben, on the other hand, can hardly get out of bed in the morning. He so looked forward to his senior year of high school, making memories with his friends, finishing out his last year of baseball, graduation, open houses, parties, getting ready to head off to college. But now he's stuck at home with his dysfunctional family, with no idea of how or when he might be able to move on with the next steps of his life. Maybe you can, or maybe someone you know can relate to Shirley's fears or to Ben's grief. If so, I want to offer you some hope today in today's sermon. I'm not suggesting that this one sermon will end your struggles if you're battling something serious like depression or anxiety. That struggle will continue. But by the way, if you are struggling mentally or emotionally right now, you should most definitely talk to your doctor and then also seek God and talk to a Christian friend or three about it. Let me encourage you to do that. But what I am saying is that I hope to point you to a refuge in this time of storm. Here's the question. Can joy, that's right, joy, can joy be found in a time filled with such worry and sadness? Now, when I say joy, I don't mean that happy, clappy kind of joy. Cheap joy that's out of touch with the sad, scary realities of life. I'm talking about that rich kind of joy that flourishes, not in ignorance of sorrow, but in spite of it. I'm not talking about the joy that 5-year-old who plays recklessly on the playground because she's never been sick or hurt in her entire life. I'm talking instead about that earned joy of the 60-year-old cancer survivor who knows how to enjoy that first breath of fresh air in the morning. Right? And I'm not talking about the joy of newlyweds, whose marital bond has not really been tested yet. But I'm talking about the joy of that marriage that's weathered decades of storms. Is that kind of joy, real, rich joy, available to us even in this time? You see, there's so much chaos in the world today that for me, at least, it feels like the world is falling apart. It just feels like that. There's the pandemic, of course, and there's unemployment and social isolation and mental health struggles, but that's just the tip of the iceberg because our ultimate enemy is Satan, who leads the invisible forces of the world in a rebellion against God, and sin, that impulse in everyone's heart that joins in that rebellion against God, and death, the enemy that we all deserve because of our sin. Those ultimate enemies are waging war on us right now. They're hard at work, even in the midst of the pandemic and everything else that's going on. And so the question is, when the world is falling apart, when the forces of evil seem to be winning, how can anyone survive, let alone thrive? That, of course, is the question we're asking in this series on Psalm 46, in finding refuge in God, spiritual renewal in a time of in a time of chaos. In the middle of this chaos, we need a safe place to go. Fighting Satan and sin and death is a suicide mission if we choose to do it alone. So we need a mighty refuge that we can run into. We need a powerful ally to protect us. We need God. Simply put, I know that's on the nose, but we need God. Our only hope now as ever is spiritual renewal, to find our relationship with God renewed, made alive once again. This spiritual renewal is the first half of Calvary's vision. We want to be an indispensable asset in the spiritual and cultural renewal of the greater Muskegon area. And spiritual renewal is something that's on our hearts and minds right now. No vaccine, no hand washing, no friend, no family member, no stimulus check, no job, no Netflix, no nothing can ultimately protect us. What we really need is God. What we really need is to have a renewed relationship with him, to return to him, to be saved by him. And you might ask, well, how can something like that, how can we turn our mind to something so abstract like that in a time like this? Well, I'd answer, how can we not? Where else do we have to turn when the world itself appears to be falling apart? Here's our big idea for our series. Even in times of chaos, God's people can move from fear to faith to worship to mission. Let me say that one more time. Even in times of chaos, God's people can move from fear to faith to worship to mission. This is the bold action plan of Psalm 46. The person who wrote Psalm 46 outlines this path for us to take in our minds and in our relationships, a path of spiritual renewal from fear to faith to worship to mission. It's a psalm of trust, and it begins with God's people taking refuge in him in faith, and it culminates with his praises being sung around the planet in mission. It's a beautiful psalm. It's a psalm about spiritual renewal in a time of chaos. Last week, we looked at verses 1 through 3 and talked about moving from fear of chaos to faith in God. I want to read those verses, a couple of those verses with you again. And if you mean these verses, I want you to, or even if you want to mean them in this time, you want to mean this stuff, let me encourage you, read this along with me right now out loud, wherever you're watching this, in your home, on your phone, wherever. Psalm 46, verses 1 and 2. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Wasn't it nice to be able to say that and to mean it, or at least to want to mean it in this time? But spiritual renewal does not stop with mere faith in God as our refuge. There's another step, and it's in this step that we find joy. We can move from faith in God to worship of him. That's where we'll find that full, rich, earned joy. And for that, we turn to the next section in Psalm 46, verses 4 through 7. Let me read that passage for us. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. I want to help us to visualize what's going on in this psalm here. In the ancient world, a city under siege needed a river to provide a constant supply of water. Even if armies cut off your food, you could last for days if you had a reliable water source. But without water, you were done for as a city. You'd have to send the white flag up the flagpole. We surrender. Come on in. You're victorious. Well, this psalm claims that there is a river in Jerusalem. Really? I don't think so. Here's a satellite image of modern-day Jerusalem. You can see it right there. Do you see a river running through Jerusalem, the city of God? No, of course not. Jerusalem is built up on a hill, not in a river valley like many cities, ancient and modern, are built around rivers today. Psalm 46, then, is not talking about a literal river. In the second line of verse 4, it tells us what the metaphorical river is, and that is, it's God's temple. It's where God lived. That's right. God lived in the temple, in the middle of his city, the city of Jerusalem. Now, Israel, and we, of course, understand that God created the entire universe, and even the entire universe cannot contain him. So he certainly is not limited, like God can fit inside the temple, and that's the only place where he lives. Of course not. We recognize that God is everywhere, all at once, and he's even larger than all of the space of the entire universe that he created. But the temple symbolized God's special presence among his people. The temple was where the one true God was put on display, where the one true God was taught and sung about, and the people were instructed in his ways, and sacrifices were offered in honor to him, and prayers were prayed that reflected his name. And the temple is where God was put on display, and it was where the people went to worship God, to respond to the God who was put on display in front of them. Well, here's an important question. What is worship? What is that? I want to be sure to define that word. Worship is gladly giving something your everything because you believe it's deserved. Worship is gladly giving something your everything because you believe it's deserved. You know, we can worship all sorts of things. We can think that all sorts of things deserve our everything. Money, a significant other, maybe a career or a hobby, or maybe even ourselves. We can worship ourselves. The sad thing is that nothing in this world deserves our everything. Nothing in this world deserves our undying allegiance and affection and obedience. In fact, worshiping the stuff of this world, it will only lead to not only disappointment, it'll fail us some way, somehow along the road, but it'll also condemn us as sinners. Because true worship, according to the scriptures, true worship is gladly giving God your everything because he deserves it. And in this psalm, God's people gladly gave God their everything. They gave him their all, their undying allegiance in this psalm because they believed he deserved it. They would, in the temple, in the God's holy dwelling place, they would recall the amazing things God had done and the amazing aspects of who he was, and they would become glad, even though the world is falling down around them, even though the city is under siege, so to speak, even though things around them are breaking down, they find this gladness in God. Because God's presence causes his people to worship. God then, think about it like this. God was like this never-ending water supply for a thirsty city under siege. Now, for Christians today, I mean, we don't have a physical temple. The temple was destroyed thousands of years ago, and even if it was still here, Christians don't have a physical temple in which to see God and in which to worship God. Christians do it a little differently. John chapter 1, verse 14. Here's how this truth applies for us. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, this amazing sentence comes from one of Jesus' closest friends and disciples, John the Apostle. And after spending years up close and personal with Jesus, John came to this conclusion that Jesus, the Word here, is God in the flesh. In other words, Jesus is God's dwelling place among us. In other words, here's the conclusion John came to. After years of watching Jesus teach the crowds and heal the sick and die on the cross and rise from the dead, John's conclusion is that Christ is God's temple. Jesus is where God lives among his people today. So in Jesus, we see God's love and truth, his glory, everything that makes him deserve our everything. That's what we see in Jesus. Jesus is God in the flesh, a living temple, and his presence makes us glad no matter what we're talking about, no matter what's going on in our lives. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about moving from faith in God to worship of God. You see, if faith is stepping through the doorway for the first time into God's house, worship is enjoying our life there with him. The first step in moving from faith in God to worship of God is to be confident in Christ's protection. Like a child needs to feel and be safe in their own home in order to thrive as they grow, you and I need to be and feel safe in order to thrive in God's house as we grow. And if you look closely at Psalm 46, total security, the total security of God's people is a huge theme in these verses. I want to follow the logic very closely of verses 5 and 6 in Psalm 46. So if you read, we'll reread those two verses now, verses 5 and 6 of Psalm 46. It says, God is within her. The her there is the city, Jerusalem. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar. Kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice. The earth melts. You see, here's the logic to these verses. If God lives in the city and he's made Jerusalem, the temple specifically, his home, he's not going to let his own house fall down. God will stand up to any intruder that tries to break into his home, and he will have his way with them. In fact, the phrase there, break of day, could be this callback to the Exodus story in Exodus 14, verse 27, where at daybreak, God caused the sea he had parted in order for the Israelites to walk through on dry land. God at daybreak causes the sea to collapse back down on Pharaoh's army as they pursued God's people through the sea. This is God standing up for his people. This is God standing up for his home. He will defend it if called upon. And if God will protect his home, then he will absolutely act to save it from the rebellious, unstable forces of chaos in this world. God's voice, the psalmist says, God, all he has to do is lift his voice and he can melt the earth. Just as God's voice made the world in the creation story, as God creates in the 6 days of creation, he speaks things into existence. His voice can unmake the world. That's the kind of God we worship. That's the kind of God we serve. And it gives us absolute confidence in his protection. And so here's the payoff for us as Christians. If those of us who are in Christ and we trust Jesus, died for our sin, we've repented and we're following him, if we belong to his church then and his people, we are absolutely safe. Absolutely safe. Death itself won't have the final say, because God will resurrect those who are his. We can literally say this to our greatest enemies of Satan, sin, and death. We can say, do your worst, enemies of God and enemies of his people. Infect me, bankrupt me, depress me, worry me, torment me, tempt me, slay me. And my God, who is my refuge, will see me through. That's the kind of confidence God's people can have in their protection in him. And that's how we get on that path from faith to worship. Number 2 is be content with his presence. A Calvary member recently told me that they weren't sure if they'd have a job in the very near future. Their department at work was scaling back. There was some non-essential things that were being cut, and so there was a lack of demand, and there was just no guarantee that there would be work the next day. But with great trust in God, this brother texted me the words, daily bread. And I knew exactly what he meant. Because in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus teaches his people to pray, give us today our daily bread. You see, my brother was trusting God to provide for those daily needs, to provide for the daily needs of both him and his family. So epic to have that kind of trust in God. We'll be content with what God gives us today, and then we'll wait and see what he provides for us tomorrow. But we're trusting in him. In a recent life group meeting on Zoom, that's an experience, let me tell you, a Zoom life group meeting. One friend who'd experienced the ups and downs of this life said that even in hard times, it's so encouraging to know that not only that the all-powerful God of the universe is with us, but that he is very intentionally teaching and growing us to become the kind of people he wants us to become. You know, this is a fantastic way to recognize God's presence, looking for spiritual growth and being grateful for it. You see, if all God ever did for me for the rest of my life was make me more like Jesus, I'd be more than happy with that. He's not going to let his people fall. That's not what he does. He is going to give you and I what you and I need. Will Jesus give us all the money and all the stuff and all the fame and all the relationships we want? No, that's not what's promised. But he will protect his temple. He will protect his church, the church which he died for and paid for with his own blood. You see, we can be content with that. We can be grateful for that. And yes, we can even be glad for that. Number 3, celebrate him with his people. We're inching now in Psalm 46, we're inching closer and closer to that final stage of spiritual renewal mission in Psalm 46. But this is just such an essential aspect of worship that we have to go here now. Because if God is with his people, they sing. They sing loudly. And here's what they sing specifically. This next verse, verse 7, gets echoed twice in this psalm. It's repeated at the very end of the psalm. And here's what God's people sing. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Of course, that verse becomes the inspiration for the song we've been singing throughout this series on Psalm 46. A mighty fortress is our God. But I want to draw attention especially to the title here, the God of Jacob. You see, the mention of Jacob here is really important because Jacob was chosen by God not because he deserved it, but because of God's mercy. Jacob was the younger twin to his older brother Esau, and he was chosen by God, though, to be the greatest. But he was chosen before he was even born. You see, so Jacob never earned the position of being the greater brother. Never earned it. God chose him out of his mercy to make him so. You see, our security and spot in God's family is totally undeserved. Totally undeserved. God has called his people out of his mercy. It's not based on anything we did right. And at first glance, this is a huge shot to our pride, right? Because we want to do something, right? To get in, right? To earn our way in. But this is good. I mean, we want our pride to get shot down. We must get rid of any sense of entitlement if we're going to be in God's house. But God's merciful choice doesn't just devastate my pride. It gives me great joy to think that God called me as his own, and I didn't even earn this. It's just a free gift. His forgiveness and his acceptance and adoption into his family, these things are freely given to me. Look at how Peter, one of Jesus' other disciples, reflects on this kind of celebration that we've been chosen by God out of God's mercy, not because we deserved it. Look at how he reflects on the celebration as the people of God in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 5, and then we'll also read 9 through 10. He says, "You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." So here Peter envisions the church as the new temple of God through Jesus. And then he says, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So sing it from the rooftops." This is what celebration looks like. So in this passage, the church now has become God's temple through Jesus. I mean, that in itself is breathtaking. And we'll talk more about this next week. But for now, just know that to a watching world, to the people who are lost and don't have the hope of Jesus in this world, the church, the people of God, is where God lives and reveals himself. He reveals himself through the things we say and how we relate to each other and how we relate to them. That's how God reveals himself in the world today. And one of the ways God reveals himself through his people is through our celebration of who God is. See, talking about how good our God is second nature to those of us who have received mercy. God has given us so much. He's forgiven us. He's overlooked so many of our sins. In fact, he's credited those sins to Jesus, and Jesus paid for them at the cross. We have received such mercy. We will never be able to stop singing about this stuff and talking about it. Now, here's the thing, though. We may not, this is a sad and scary life that we live in. And as I talked about earlier, there's a lot of grief, and there's a lot of worry. There's a lot of depression, and there's a lot of anxiety. And those things are, frankly, it makes sense that would be part of this broken world. We may not always be able to talk about how good our jobs are, how good our health is, how good our relationships are, or our bank accounts, or whatever. But we will always, and here's the point of Psalm 46, with God is within her. We will always be able to talk about how good our God is, and that is how we worship him. Here's the question I'd like you to think about for this morning. We'll discuss it in a moment during our Facebook Live event. Feel free to discuss this with your family, with your household. Feel free to carry it with you throughout the week and be thinking about this. But here's the question. What aspect of God and or his work has made you glad recently? What is it about God? What is it about his work in your life that recently has made you glad, even in tough times like this? Let's take a moment to reflect on that and celebrate God's goodness and greatness among us as a church family. Thank you very much.